Hey everybody, this is Chris with Overclockers Club. It's time for part 2. So this is the continuation from part 1, and I was waiting on the key ingredient. I finally have it. This stuff is worth its weight in gold. DDR5 memory. But I was fortunate enough to get some. The memory here, of course. Right. Okay, the CPU we'll be using here is the 12700KF here from Intel. Haven't even opened it yet. That will sit up here, of course, in the CPU slot. Get the memory in there. I'm just now getting things sort of connected. I got the power, the main 24 pin connector there to the motherboard. I've got the solid state drive in there, and with this cooler from Be Quiet, I don't know how well that's going to work, so I'll probably take the cooler off and just run the drive bare and use the heatsink here from the motherboard. Something to point out, in the wintertime when the humidity is low and there's static discharge pretty much everywhere, it's good to invest a few dollars in an anti-static wrist strap. I have it connected to the frame of my test bench, and the test bench is grounded to the tabletop, and the tabletop is electrically grounded outside to the ground, of course. So this will minimize any issues with static discharge, which is so important when you're handling memory, motherboards, CPUs, pretty much any electrical component. Now, as I get ready to put the memory modules, the RAM modules, into the slots, it's important to show that this over here shows you that there's A1, A2, B1, and B2. So it's A1, A2, B1, and B2. Now, you might think you would use A1 and B1 first, but this actually shows you right there. It says first you want to use, let me get a little closer there, A2 and B2 is what they recommend. So I'll use this slot and this slot to put the modules in. So using, whoops, focus wants to go all wonky on me. So using A2 and B2 is pretty common. I can't say every motherboard does it that way, but that's not unusual. So we make sure those are seated, and usually you hear a little bit of a click, and then you sort of follow up and push the little retention clips in. Okay, we are good to go. And now it is time to get the CPU on there. So we can take this protective plastic cover off very carefully, since we are now ready to put the CPU on. That should just pop right off. There we go. Set it off to the side, and then we can release the lever and there we go, pull the other side back. All right, now there is a certain way that the CPU goes on. So you want to pay attention to that. And there is usually a little arrow pointing to the corner. And if you look, actually, it's on the top. Right here, there's a little triangle. You can see it right there, and that indicates that the little triangle on the bottom corner of your CPU, if you can see it through the plastic right there, you line those two triangles up. So we'll get this out of the little protective plastic. There we go, there's the CPU. And we will very carefully place it like that. Now, another way you know you've got it in there right is there are little radius notches at the top and the bottom, and it will only go on one way. The notches only fit when the CPU is in there the right way. So if those aren't lining up and the triangles don't line up, then do not try to complete the installation. And then we pull the lever down and lock it underneath. And again, the little triangle there and the little triangle there should line up. And I'll get in a little closer here. If I get the angle just right, there you can see the two triangles and how the CPU lines up on the motherboard. Okay, so I've got the memory installed, CPU is installed, and I think what I'm going to do on this solid state drive, I took the heatsink that was on there off, and I'll just use the heatsink here from the motherboard. But to make this look right, I think what I'm going to do is, so I have to peel this protective plastic cover off to expose the thermal layer there. And since the solid state drive only goes to this distance right here, I'm going to cut the plastic protective cover and leave the back section here covered. That way we'll keep dust and dirt from sticking to it. And I got the little plastic cover cut down to size so you can see it only covers the exposed part of the thermal layer there that is not being used. So that'll keep dust and dirt from accumulating on that. Alright, so MSI has this neat little way to retain your drive. So you push your drive down and there's this little plastic lever arm. You just swing it over and you can see it locks your drive in place. And now I'm ready for the top cover heatsink. And I did the same thing. I cut the plastic off only on the area that it's going to be in contact with the solid state drive given its length. So if I ever use a longer solid state drive, then I can expose the rest of that thermal layer there. Now you don't have to cut that cover at all. That's just something I'm doing since there's a high probability that I will be testing multiple solid state drives in the future. Oh, I almost forgot. As you can see, the solid state drive I'll be using for the system build is the SK Hynix Gold P31 NVMe. This is a 1 terabyte drive. I've already reviewed it and I'll post the link to that. So now I can get the heatsink on there. Okay, so the solid state drive is installed. The next thing to do is to get a cooler on there for the CPU. And thanks to MSI, we'll be using the all-new MAG Core Liquid C280, which is compatible with Intel's new socket LGA 1700. Alright, so everything is pretty much installed. I went ahead and connected the fans and I put them in this orientation so they're easier to see the RGB effects. Now the first thing is the pump connector here goes to the pump header. So it says right here on the motherboard, this is pump fan 1. So this connector drives the pump. And then we have the splitter here. This is where both fans connect to this 2-in-1 splitter. Again, it's a little messy over here with the wiring going everywhere. But I'll connect this one to the CPU fan 1. So now we have power to the fans and power to the pump. And then this is your RGB connector coming off of the head unit here. And again, it has the female and the male connector. And you have to pull that little protective cover off because these pins are a little delicate. So this will go to the J Rainbow number 2 connector. There's another one. There's a J Rainbow 1 at the other end of the motherboard, but we're going to use this one here at the top since it's so close to the fans. And then the other end of it, and again it gets a little messy here with all the wiring, but the other end has the male connection. So take the connector off, save that for now. And what you do is you come over to one of your fans, find the RGB connector from that, and it plugs in to the female connector there, and then you have another male connector that comes over to the final fan, and we connect that all up, and you have one connector that just isn't used over here. It's a male connector. So you're daisy chaining everything together. So all of these are running off of one RGB connector there. Okay, so everything seems to be running. I do have the MAG or the MAG Core Liquid C280 on the system now. This will be covered in a separate review just for that cooler. So keep that in mind, and I'll post a link to that eventually. But there's the cooler and the radiator over there. And again, everything seems to function fine. I haven't done any real stress testing just yet. I did do a little folding at home testing. So I've got two CPU or GPUs on here. I've got the 3070 Ti and a 2070 Super. So I was just playing around to see how they perform. No real issues there. I will say one thing. Windows 10, which was what was on the solid state drive that I put on this system. It was actually from my previous Z90 build on an Asus motherboard. It died, so I just popped the same solid state drive in here, and it fired right up. Did some driver updates, ran through the BIOS update. I haven't really tweaked the BIOS just yet. But what I'll do next is put Windows 11 on here, and I've got the installer on this little flash drive. And the reason I want to try it on Windows 11 is that from what I've read, I'm hearing that the Alder Lake CPUs don't work quite as well with Windows 10. Windows 10 doesn't have the optimization within the operating system to play nicely with the Alder Lake. So Windows 11 does. That's what I'm hearing, and I'm going to sort of test that a little bit and see if I notice any difference between 10 and 11. So next I'll get Windows 11 installed, see what that's like. So yeah, I know the motherboard review here is sort of turning into a system build, but really if you're looking at this motherboard, you're going to put it in a system anyway. So ultimately what I'll do is get all of this stuff put into a nice MSI case, and we'll look into that a little later. And to my point here with folding at home, the GPU performance is fine. Now these two GPUs that are on the system now, they've completed their work units and they performed as I expected. But the CPU here is only, well, it's not really challenged at all. Usually this thing's pegged at 100% or very close to it. And I'm not really seeing that here. So my guess is something to do with the operating system, the way the CPU is managed. So we'll compare the performance in Windows 11. Okay, Windows 11, huge improvement for folding at home. Now, the reality of it is most people don't use their CPU for folding anymore because there's not a lot of bang for the buck compared to what you can get out of your GPUs as far as your points per day. But this was just to see what the difference was, at least for the CPU on folding, and there's a huge difference. You can see we pretty much have all the cores pegged. The MSI app is showing 91 to 94%. Windows Task Manager is showing pretty much 100%. And clearly from the temperatures, and let's see, I'm holding at about 70, 71 degrees Celsius. We're definitely putting a little bit of stress on the system there. But Windows 11, huge improvement with CPU management, at least for folding at home. Okay, so we'll talk about the BIOS here in just a few minutes. But before I do that, I want to talk about overclocking. And generally speaking, this is a decent board for overclocking. I fooled around with it a little bit, but that's something that really takes a lot of time, and that could be a whole other video by itself on overclocking. But you know, years ago, your CPUs and your motherboards, there was a lot of overhead, a lot of really open space there for overclocking. If you wanted to put the time into tweaking your system a little bit, you could get some significant performance improvements. And you can do the same thing with your graphics card and your memory too. You can spend some time tweaking those. But I tell you, the modern processors, and it's really been this way for several years, there's so much power and speed that these have. Even the mid-range and lower range CPUs today almost blow the doors off the higher end CPUs from a few years ago. And when you combine that with a really super fast M.2 NVMe SSD here, you really have a screaming system just right out of the box. So it becomes diminishing returns on your overclocking. You know, a lot of these motherboards have your canned overclock settings that you can pick from a light overclock, medium overclock, or a high overclock. And you know, you can play around with those and see where it gets you. But you know, anymore it's almost not worth a whole lot of time to spend fooling with it, because there's just not nearly as much bang for the buck as there used to be. So I'm not saying don't overclock. I'm just saying I don't know that it's as worth the effort as much as it used to be. So anyway, we'll move on and take a look at the BIOS now. All right, now we'll take a quick tour through the BIOS. So let's see, we got a couple of XMP profiles you can choose from. Definitely you want to take advantage of those. Over here's some basic information about your system. Let's see the BIOS mode. Let's see what version. Yeah, there's the version of the BIOS. So that tells me if I need to upgrade or not. There's the advanced or the easy mode tab. So you can sort of check things out in more detail in the advanced mode. Here's some fan information so we can sort of see what's going on with the fans. So you got your system fan, CPU, PCH. All of this information here is useful. And you can look at your fan speeds and your profile for each fan, how that's mapped. You can set it to an automatic, like a smart mode or a custom profile. And back to the main page, here's your storage, so you can look at what's going on there, your memory information and your CPU information. And then over here we've got other areas that we can check out. Let's see, hardware monitor. Okay, this takes us back to the fan control, fan information. Favorites, M flash for BIOS. Upgrading, let's see. Let's go over to the settings and we can drill down through here. This is your system status, so you can see what's going on, sort of a big picture. Here's your DMI information. Again, this is all part of the system status section. We can go over to advanced. Now we can really start drilling down into some of the more interesting parts. Here's your boot section, so you can look at your boot devices, boot order. Then we got security, so you can check out all of your security options. Most of this stuff, you know, once you get into it, check it out. There's really not much you can do with it. Over here's your overclocking information. There's just a ton of stuff here. I usually leave most of this stuff at the default. You can go in there and tweak it a little, but you really need to look into it and know what you're doing. Every so often there's some new terms that pop up and you need to educate yourself on what they do. Over here on the right, you can see it's changing every time I mouse over something. That's an information section, and usually it's pretty sad. Most of the time it doesn't tell you much. It seems to be that way with every motherboard, every BIOS I look at. So most of the stuff you have to Google and look it up on your own and figure out if it's something you want to play with or not. Like I said earlier, you know, most of this stuff right out of the box, it's pretty fast. So yeah, can you get some more speed, some more frames per second? Sure, but it takes a little bit of work to get there sometimes. So this is the section where you can look at your memory settings in more detail. You can look at your different profiles for your XMP, XMP1, XMP2. And you can look at your CPU specifications again in more detail. And when you've got everything tweaked the way you want it, when you do a save and exit, it sort of shows you everything that changed, and you can make a decision whether you want to accept that and move on with a reboot or go back and make a few more tweaks. Now this is your MSI center. Now this has to be installed. You can download it from the motherboard support section on the MSI website. But after you install this, this sort of gives you like a control panel that you can get into some of the features. And here's your Mystic Light, for example. You can get in there and play with the different devices that are capable of being synchronized all together, or you can control them independently if you like. And then you can save different profiles. It's fun to play with, but usually once you get it all set up the way you like it, I don't know, I don't usually come back and do much in the way of tweaking afterwards. And here's a little graphic representation of your devices. You can see what's going on. different profiles, and synchronize stuff with the games, whatever game you've got. And then up here we can look at some, they're like little modules that you can install. They're different feature sets. And then these are your main settings. You can look at your hardware monitoring, so you can sort of keep tabs on what's going on. Come back over here, here's your system information. A lot of this stuff is sort of a condensed version of what you would find in your BIOS, but it's a quick way to look at some of this information without having to actually be in the BIOS. So this scans your system, looks for anything that needs to be updated. And there you can see all the different drivers and utilities also, what version you're on, if they need to be updated or not. So I'm pretty much up to date. And let's see, here's the advanced update. Nothing there? All right. So that is pretty much how that works. And for the system build, we'll be using the Secura 500P from MSI, and the power supply that is already in there is the MPG A750GF. Now I've already reviewed the case and the power supply, so you can check those out. I'll have those links posted. The monitor we'll be using is the Artemis 343 CQR over here that I've already reviewed. You can check that out. Also, here is the GeForce RTX 2070 Super. And of course, we're using the MSI cooler there, which is the MAG Core Liquid C280. I'll put the list up here of all of the components so you can see. We're even using a mouse here, the Clutch GM41. Also reviewed that from MSI. The installation in the Secura 500P is going well. A couple things I want to point out though before we get too far into it. Okay, so the two power connectors up here for the CPU, they can be a little hard to get to, especially if you have large hands, so you might want to get those plugged in before you put your radiator in there. And if you use a big air cooler that usually sits right here, those might be hard to get to. The second thing is always be careful here on your USB-C connector. Let me unplug that. So it looks like that can go in either way, but it can't. So you need to make sure that you have the end of the plug oriented with the socket before you plug it in, or you might damage it. So everything fired up without any issues. After the assembly was complete, there's the Wi-Fi antenna back there, just sitting on top of the case, but no issues here. Everything roared to life on the first shot, which is always good. And I'll be bouncing back and forth between these two monitors while I do some other testing. And of course, when you get your new system running, what's the first thing you should do? A little bit of gaming. Of course, this is one of my favorites, Titanfall 2. Yeah, it's a little bit old, but still really enjoy it. Okay, so we'll start to get this all wrapped up here. Real quick, looking at the feature set again. You know, when you're looking at a motherboard, especially if you're upgrading your system, and like I mentioned earlier about being future-proof, well, what is future-proof, right? Is it measured in years or sometimes months? So ideally, if you can time your upgrade with something that is just coming out, you know you're getting the latest and greatest, and that's pretty much what this is. You've got your Z690 chipset. What I like about this motherboard, you got your DDR5 support. So as DDR5 matures and more options become available, I know it's really hard right now to find any, but that door is open there for different memory options in the future. We have our connectivity here for our devices. We're at the top edge of current connection speeds. So you got your Lightning Gen 5, you got your Lightning USB 20G. Again, those are important considerations, again, for trying to be as future-proof as you can. We got Wi-Fi 6E, you got your Bluetooth 5.2, that's all important, plus the multiple locations for your small M.2 SSDs, also a deciding factor. So that sort of brings me over to pricing right now. Of course, this changes from time to time, but right now we've got a few options when it comes to this motherboard. If I can get my screens back up here. Okay, so right now on Amazon, let me get this over here. So on Amazon right now, you can find this board for, let's see, $399. I think the list price was right around that when it first came out. This has only been out just for a couple months. But if you come over here to Newegg, Newegg has it for $369. So there's a little bit of a savings at Newegg. But again, these prices, they jump back and forth from retailer to retailer. So I think that's you know, a decent price. You're getting a fairly powerful motherboard. Again, you know, how often do you upgrade your motherboard? Is it worth the investment? That's something you have to think about. And then the other big factor is which CPU are you going to purchase for the motherboard. You've got several options there, and there's a fair range in terms of cost, depending upon which route you go. So overall, I really like this motherboard, and it really looks good in this case. Easy to set up, no issues, and it should keep you future-proof, at least for a couple of years. So I would give this the Overclockers Club Gold Award. This is Chris with Overclockers Club. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.